What's up, everybody? Welcome to City Life this weekend. We are going to have a really fun time today. We are going to celebrate baptisms at the end of the gathering, and can't wait for that. It's always a party, and so I'm really happy that you're here to experience that. I believe your faith is going to be built today. You're going to be encouraged. I have the privilege of being the lead pastor at City Life. My name is Brad, if we haven't met before. I also have the privilege of being a dad to 4 kids. And listen, anytime I get the opportunity to watch them by myself, it's always an adventure. I was thinking back to one of those adventures that we had. Leah was going into Center City with her sister to celebrate a birthday. And so I was holding down the fort at home, Mr. Mom, and Caleb and I, my son, we were hanging out together in my bedroom when we heard a big pop outside the window, and then all of the lights went out throughout the house. And so I immediately knew this is bad. The power is gone. The electricity is gone. And so Caleb and I went outside to investigate, and all of the neighbors down our street on 20th Street, they were all coming out of their houses. They were all looking up. They were all, it seemed like, experiencing the same thing. So I got on the phone with Pico, and sure enough, found out that 21 houses on our street had lost power. 21 houses. So I went back inside, and listen, if it's Mr. Mom for a night, 4 kids, and you have no electricity, you have no power, how many of you know we're going out to eat for dinner? And so I told the kids, get ready, we're going out for dinner. And so I, hurdled them outside, and we were about to load up in the van when all of a sudden I heard one of the kids just kind of shriek, and I turned around to investigate, and there was a little squirrel laying on the sidewalk right underneath the power lines, right underneath the transformer. And so we started to fill in the blanks. I walked over to look at this little squirrel. He was just laying there like, and you knew what had happened. This little guy took out the power on the entire street, 21 houses out of power. And it struck me that day that small things can have a big impact if they're willing to go all in. It's like that little squirrel. And we're in this series called How to Amaze Jesus, and we're looking at moments from the life and ministry of Jesus when he met someone who pleasantly surprised him with their faith. And the common denominator throughout these stories, I don't know if you've noticed this, we've looked at 3 stories so far, we're going to look at a 4th one today, is that all of these are people that you would not expect to have pleasantly surprised Jesus with their faith. They were outsiders. Pastor Derek told us a story a few weeks ago of a Roman centurion. He was a high-ranking official in the Roman government. They were the occupying force in Israel, not someone from the inside of Judaism that you would expect would amaze Jesus. We looked last week at the story of a mom from Syria in a part of the world that worshiped false gods, that was full of false religion. And Jesus met her, and she pushed through so many barriers to get to him and to get him to meet her need that Jesus looks at this mom and says, wow, your faith is amazing. Pastor Daryl took us through the story of a woman who came in to a party that Jesus was attending, a fancy party, and she busted through, came in off the streets. She was most likely a sex worker. And she finds Jesus there being entertained by these wealthy guests, and she comes and just throws herself at his feet. She takes a bottle of perfume that was worth 1 year's wages, and she busts it open and she pours it all out on Jesus and wiped it up with her hair, just pouring out her heart, her love to Jesus. And Jesus was so blown away by her instinctive heart to worship him, by her gratitude, by her passion, that he looked at her and said, what you have done for me today, it's going to be told over and over and over wherever the gospel is preached. Your story is going to get told. And look at these stories and the one we're going to look at today. And it's so amazing because these are people that you would not have expected to be the ones who would amaze Jesus. They were outsiders. And I don't know where this hits you. I don't know why you're here today. You might be here today and you're not a church person. Maybe it's been years since you've been in a church. Maybe somebody invited you. Maybe you're here today to cheer on somebody who's getting baptized in a little bit. Maybe you logged in online and you're skeptical about this whole church thing. Maybe there is parts of the Bible that confuse you, that you don't understand. I think we can look and say, wow, Brad, I don't know that this is for me. I've got a past. I've been through some trauma. I've inflicted some trauma on some other people. I don't come from a family that was religious. I don't come from a family that was a part of a church. And I hope that this series is encouraging you, because what it reminds us is that Jesus and the beauty and the purpose of the gospel is to fling the door wide open so that you can come in with your past, with your mistakes, with your shame, with your mess, and find at the foot of Jesus and at the foot of the cross a level playing field. Because what it takes to put a smile on God's face and even make Jesus marvel is a heart that's ready to respond to him the right way in the right circumstances. And so I want to tell you another story today from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12. And it's at a point in Jesus' ministry in which things are really ramping up. He is days away, as we're going to see, from being crucified on the cross. And with the end kind of closing in on him, he's getting really bold in his teaching. He's getting provocative. He is getting a little intense. And so this passage that we're going to read today, you can kind of feel things heating up for Jesus. In Mark 12, starting in verse 38, Jesus also taught, beware of these teachers of religious law. So Jesus was in the temple as he was teaching, and there would have been a lot of religious leaders around, Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes there. Many of them were in the crowd listening to Jesus. Some of them were just walking through the temple courts, doing their religious obligation. And Jesus points to them as he's in this teaching, and he's like, hey, listen, everybody, you got to watch out for these guys. You got to be careful when you're around these guys and listening to them. Should have been fascinating and interesting to think, why would Jesus say this? Because these were the men who had the responsibility of interpreting the law, telling people how they were supposed to live. They carried incredible religious influence and authority. They were really the religious power brokers of the day. Yet Jesus says, you got to beware of these religious teachers, and he gives them the reason why. Because they like to parade around in flowing robes and receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces, and how they love the seats of honor in the synagogues and the head table at banquets. So these religious leaders loved when they were out in town, when they were shopping in the marketplaces, when they were coming into the temple, for everybody to see how important they were. They loved to display their prominence. They dressed to impress and draw attention to themselves. Whatever room or environment that they were in, they were working it so that they could get the VIP seating. And that when people saw them, they would know, this guy's important. This guy matters. And so they loved that attention. And yet, for as stunning as their public persona may have seemed, Jesus is going to say that if you had been able to open up their chest and actually taken a look on the interior, at their heart, he says you would be disgusted at what you would see. Because look at the hypocrisy in verse 40. He says, yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property and then pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. Because of this, they will be more severely punished. So he says, while they're making these long prayers and looking to be so respectful and powerful and religious, he says they're ripping widows off. They're cheating the poor. In fact, we have insight into one expression of this, because around this time in Jesus' ministry, he came into this same temple and he saw something that so outraged him that he ran people out of the temple. And it was a system that the religious leaders had approved and sanctioned, in which all of these vendors had set up little shops in the temple, and people who were making pilgrimages to Jerusalem to worship God at the temple, who were traveling for days and couldn't bring their own animal with them to sacrifice, maybe didn't even have an animal to sacrifice, they would come into the temple and they would need to purchase an animal. And the poorest of the poor, who couldn't even afford a little lamb, would have to get a pigeon or a dove, which was the cheapest of sacrifices to buy. And what was happening is that the religious leaders were upcharging the poorest of the poor to buy their pigeon and to buy their dove. Like if you were to go to a Phillies game or to a concert and you go to get a hot dog and you're offended, you're gonna charge me $13 right now for this hot dog that I could go home and put it in the microwave later this afternoon. But you got nowhere else to go. You are a sitting duck at Citizens Bank Park if you're hungry and you want to eat. And that's what would happen to the poor who would pilgrimage to Jerusalem and be there to worship God, is that they would have to buy an offering. They were getting ripped off, and Jesus, it turned his stomach when he saw it. And now he's looking at these religious leaders and he's saying they look so good on the outside, but their hearts are actually hard and selfish and greedy, and they lack the compassion, which is the whole reason for which I came. So Jesus is going for it. You can kind of feel that, can't you? And he's ramping it up and things are heating up. And then he kind of goes, as he finishes up this little teaching, over to the side and he sits down to do some people watching. Here's what it says in verse 41, that Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. So Jesus walks over by the offering box and he just kind of sits down. I don't know if you've ever gone to the mall or gone to the park just to do some people watching. It's free entertainment. Very entertaining. And that's what Jesus is doing. He just sits down over there in the temple and he's watching people just come put their offerings in the collection box. Now, he would have been in the temple proper, the outer courts of the temple. There would have been, likely, historians tell us, 13 chests that were shaped like trumpets, and each one of them had a specific purpose. So one of them might have a sign that says for the cost of the incense, or for the cost of the anointing oil, or for the wood that burns the sacrifices. But you would come and you would drop your money into one of these collection boxes. For the most part, they were voluntary offerings. And so Jesus is just sitting down and he's just watching people come up to put in their offering. He's stroking his beard. That's why I'm growing this, by the way, Leah. Just be as much like Jesus as I can. And he's watching people as they come forward, and here's what he sees. It says, many rich people put in large amounts. See, how would you know that they were large amounts? It's not that they were coming up and pulling out their wallet and flipping through a big fat wad of bills. It's that they're coming forward and kind of strutting up to the front there, taking their time. And again, these chests were shaped like trumpets, and what you would put in were coins. And so they came up with a big bucket of coins. And as they would just pour those coins into those offering chests, you would just hear them rattle all the way down. And they actually had a saying in that day that if you gave a really large gift in the offering, it was called blowing the trumpet. And so wherever you were in the temple courts, like when the large gift came in, it was like, oh, he's blowing the trumpet. He's blowing the trumpet. And it would draw the attention, literally like tooting your own horn is what was taking place. It is blowing, and it would be very impressive for the crowd to see that, wow, like that's a big one. That's a big gift. But Jesus was impressed, yet it wasn't by the size of these offerings. It was by what he would see next. Verse 42, it says, then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins. So Jesus is there and he's watching this play out. And he sees in the wake of these big gifts, this poor widow come forward. Reminds me of a story. There was a pastor who was trying to raise some money for a need that they had in the church, and they really needed a good offering. And so he came before the church and he said, listen, we really need a big offering today. And so here's what we're going to do to incentivize the offering is whoever gives the most money in the offering today, you're going to get to pick 3 hymns. And so they sent the offering bucket down the rows and people put their offering in. And when they brought it up, he saw at the top of the offering a really big bill. And so he knew immediately, like, this is the winner. And so he said, who gave this? And in the back, there was an elderly, just the saint of the church, just very shy, quiet woman. And she slowly raised up her hand. And he said, please, sister, come forward. I just want to thank you personally. And so she came to the front of the church and said, thank you so much for your generosity. He said, now you get to pick 3 hymns. So she looked out over the church and all of a sudden brightened up a little bit. And her eyes locked in on the 3 most handsome men she could find in the room. And she said, I'll take him and him and him. Yeah. So I'm like, we need to do some more hymns in our church. Maybe. But this elderly woman comes forward not looking for a date, but to put in her gift. And she puts in 2 small coins. It would have been the equivalent of about 1 penny today in our economy. And what we know about her is really 2 adjectives that the gospel gives us. She was poor. And most widows would have been poor in that culture, but she was, the word that's used here by Jesus denotes the poorest of the poor, most likely homeless. And so everything she owned was what she could carry with her on her person. And not only was she poor, she was a widow. And in that day, you got to remember, without Social Security, without Medicaid, and some of the benefits that we have today, retirement was, you're married and your husband is going to take care of you. And now she doesn't have that safety net. She's on her own, and she comes forward and she puts these 2 coins into the offering, and Jesus is blown away. He's amazed. And I want you to see his response because it's brilliant. Verse 43, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions. For they gave a tiny part of their surplus, but she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on. What is it that blew Jesus away? Is that this woman put into the offering all she had to live. She went all in. In fact, the word here that Jesus uses is a really important word in the Greek. It's simply the word bios, which means life. We get our word biology, our word biography from it. In other words, Jesus says that she has put into the offering her bios, her life, everything that she had to support her life. In that moment, she put it in, her very self. And Jesus is blown away because she has gone all in. And we learn something here that's so important that I want to give to you today, this principle that I hope will encourage you to develop and cultivate a heart that puts a smile on the face of God. And it's simply this: God cares more about why you give than how much you give. He cares way more about why you give than the amount of your offering, than what's written on the check, than what you see on the screen, than what is pulled out of your checking account through that automatic transaction. He cares way more about why you're giving. Jesus is not concerned with the amount financially of the gift. What he's concerned with is the size of your heart. And that's why he praises this widow while rebuking the religious leaders, because they had big heads and big spotlights and big reputations and big ambitions, but tiny little hearts. And yet this widow had none of that, but what she had was a big heart. She had a huge heart. She had a wealthy heart. She had an affluent heart. She had a heart that was open wide. Sacrifice and worship and love to God. So while she could not have given less in the eyes of the world, she could not have given more in the eyes of God. She went all in. And as we look at her example, I just want to leave you with today 4 motivators of the heart. As you think about giving, not only financially, to the mission of God and to the needs around you, but giving your time, giving your influence, giving of your talents and your gifts. I want to give you the four motivators of the heart that amaze Jesus. And the first one is simply this, that we give out of compassion. Remember, Jesus, what he couldn't stomach in the religious leaders is that they had a big show, but they were full of greed and actually taking advantage of the people that he came to die for. The poor, the marginalized, those who were suffering, those who were struggling. They didn't have the compassion of God. What is it that God cares about the most? What is it that God values the most? It's people. And God has a special place in his heart, especially for people who are struggling, for people who don't have a voice, for orphans, for those who are lonely, for those who don't have a family. God is madly in love with the poor. He's madly in love with the blind. In fact, Jesus said, the reason I came was to receive an anointing from God to bring good news to the poor, to those who are blind, to bind up the hearts of those who've had their hearts broken by this world, for those who are in prison. James says later in the New Testament that religion that is pure and religion that is approved by God, religion that is perfect and faultless, is religion that looks after the widow, that looks after the orphan, that looks after the poor. God says, I care about those who have been traumatized in their lives. And so, listen, when the church of God disconnects itself from the heart of God, if you take the law of God but disconnect it from the heart of God, that's what draws from Jesus his fiercest rebuke. And what amazes him, what he's looking for, are hearts that are full of compassion for people who are hurting. That's what we want to be about. If we're gonna not just play a game, but be real in our worship to the Lord, and as a church that walks in the heartbeat, that carries the heartbeat of God. One of the ways we try to do that as a church is through Kingdom Builders, which is a financial fund just above and beyond the tithe that we give to as a church in order to support compassion projects around the world that God is so passionate about. It's how we rescue girls and serve girls and kids in Thailand who are victims of sex trafficking. It's the urgent crisis response fund that we have to respond to crises that happen around the world, that we're able to step in earlier this year and serve refugees who are displaced from their homes because of an earthquake in Turkey and Syria, and respond when those moments take place. It's how we do what God's called us to do here at home. One of the number one things that our Kingdom Builders giving is going toward right now and going into the month of August is opening and launching our new location of City Life in Southwest Philadelphia. And in response to starting that congregation, that location, then starting a community center out of which we can just serve the practical needs of people in Southwest Philly who need the compassionate heart of God and his people the most. That's what we want to see happen, because I believe that when God looks at Southwest Philadelphia, his heart is beating out of his chest as he sees the generational poverty, as he sees the gun violence, as he sees the trauma that people are experiencing and the addiction that people are warring against. And what he is longing for is a church that will see what he sees and that will move with compassion to the most compassion-starved communities in our city and in our world. And that's what we want to do. We're not starting another church in Southwest Philly. We're actually expanding City Life. Our vision is to be one house with many rooms. One spiritual family, one spiritual house with many rooms. And I was thinking about this because if you've ever adopted a child or been a foster care parent to kids, then you understand part of that process is the home study and the home inspection and actually getting the room approved and ready to move in that child that's gonna find themselves now in a new family, in a healthy family. I've been watching this play out in Pastor Chris and Becky's lives, in their story. Pastor Chris, our discipleship pastor, and Becky, one of our worship leaders, were trying desperately to start a family, to get pregnant, longing to be parents, longing to have a baby, not happening, and going through, many of you have experienced that, the grief, the heartache that comes with longing to be a parent and struggling with infertility. And as they wrestled through that process, praying, calling out to God, seeing doctors, they were ultimately the doctors diagnosed them with what's called unexplainable infertility. Literally, the doctor said there is no medical reason that we can find or give you as to why you can't get pregnant. How many of you are grateful that what is unexplainable to medical doctors, that God has a purpose in it and that God has a purpose for it? And so it was August of last year, just about a year ago, that God spoke to them, and what God whispered into their hearts is the reason I haven't given you a baby is because you already have one. And God put adoption on their hearts. And they especially were drawn to Thailand, and so they Googled Thailand adoption, and they found Holt International, and they applied and started going through the application process. And as you get through kind of that initial application process, then you got the home study. And so you got all of the paperwork and piles of it for weeks and weeks and weeks, and the medical evaluation and the psych evaluation and the background clearances and the child abuse clearances and hours and hours and hours of interviews. And then they were matched up with a social worker who came out to do the home inspection, started looking around the house. All right, we're gonna get this house ready. Make sure it's safe. Let's put some locks on the back door since there's a lake in the backyard. And let's get some alarms on the window where his room's gonna be. And ultimately in January, they were approved and they were matched with a beautiful 2-year-old boy in Thailand named Tanakone. And they're gonna name him Judah. Tanakone will remain his middle name. And so now they're getting the room ready. And they actually took a trip to Thailand earlier this year. They weren't able to see him yet, but they're just soaking in his culture. And they started buying some stuff in Thailand for his room because they want to carry over his culture and his heritage when he gets here. So they brought home a stuffed animal from Thailand and a piece of artwork to put up on the wall. And they've got the dresser ready to go. And they're getting the room ready. And so sometime, in the next 6 to 10 months, we're praying for 6 months, they'll get the call from the Thai government, you can come get them. And they'll get on a plane and fly to Thailand and meet their son for the first time. And he'll fly back into the Philadelphia International Airport, and they'll drive into South Jersey, and he'll walk into his brand new home, see his room with the stuffed animal and the piece of artwork, and find himself in a healthy, godly family. That's adoption. That's the power of adoption. It's the heart of compassion. God loves that heart. Compassion. And listen, what we're doing in Southwest Philly right now is we're getting the home ready. And even you're giving to kingdom builders, we're buying equipment, we're buying coffee machines and vests that the security attendants are gonna wear and toys for the kids to play with and City Life Kids and sound equipment. But what is it? Just getting the house ready. We're getting the room ready. Because in September, when that location launches, a spiritual orphan is gonna walk into Tilden Middle School in Southwest Philadelphia and find themselves adopted into a family, because that's the heart of our Father God. He sets the lonely in families. And I encourage you to be a part of it, not because, oh, we need $125,000. Listen, that's gonna take care of itself. God is in this. But it's because I want you to have a heart that's full of compassion for people that God loves. It's compassion that puts a smile on his face. And then I'm gonna give you these last three just really quickly. We give out of worship, not because it's an obligation, but because it's our most basic reflex to the grace of God in our lives. We go all in with him because he went all in for us. And Jesus, when he was giving this lesson, it was less than 48 hours from his own crucifixion. This was late in the afternoon, most likely on Wednesday. On Friday at 9 in the morning, he would hang on the cross. And I just have this hunch that when he saw this widow, what drew his heart like a magnet to her is that she was embodying what he would do 2 days later. That she was putting her life into the offering. Jesus was gonna hang himself on the cross, and he was gonna give up his bios. He was gonna lay down his life. God was gonna, the Father, give the only Son that he had for you and I to be saved, to be forgiven. And so when we give, it's not obligation, it's not religion, it's not something we have to do, it's something we get to do in response to a God who is the most generous being in the universe. And then we give out of sacrifice. And Jesus says to her, you've given the largest gift. Out of all of these offerings that have been given, yours is the biggest. Now that doesn't make any sense if he's counting the monetary value of these gifts. That's not what he was counting. Jesus doesn't count the amount of the gift, he counts the amount of the sacrifice. He doesn't count the amount of what's given, he counts the amount that's left over after the gift has been made. Because it's the proportion of the gift that he's drawn to. That there were some who gave comfortably out of their convenience what they could afford to give from their surplus. But he says, this woman has dug deep. And she has given in a way that has cost her something. And Jesus is so drawn to those who would say, I love you so much, I want to sacrifice for you in this moment. And that's what gets his attention. Compassion, hearts of worship and sacrifice, and then finally, hearts that are full of faith. It would have been so easy for this woman to have said, I've got 2 coins, 1 penny. What difference is that going to make? Honestly. At times, maybe you felt like this. I look at the needs around me in the world and it's overwhelming. So many needs, so many hurting people. It's a constant, the news comes in faster than our hearts can handle it. And we look at what we have to give in response to such need, and it can feel like, what's the point? What difference could my gift make? Could my life make? Yet it's the gift given in faith that God multiplies to make the impact. Here she is, and she gives what she has. And that's the gift that God smiles on. Reminds me of a little boy in a crowd of thousands as Jesus was teaching. They were hungry and there was nowhere for them to go. And so Jesus told his disciples, find me some food. And all they could find was a little lunch that one kid had, 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish. And he gave it to Jesus, and Jesus broke it and he blessed it. And what did he do with it? He multiplied it. And that kid's little sack lunch fed thousands. Pastor Valco told me in between services, actually, a beautiful story of a church in Seoul, Korea, that I'm very familiar with. For many years, it was the largest church in the world, pastored by a man named Paul Youngie Cho. And when they were building their building, they needed a lot of money. And they had a campaign and an offering, and people in the church were participating. And there was one woman on their big commitment night, an elderly widow in the church, who came forward, and what she brought to the offering was all she had, her rice bowl. And she put her rice bowl down at the front as everyone was turning in their offerings, turning in their commitment. You can look at it and say, how is a rice bowl going to build a building that's going to seat tens of thousands of people, a stadium, essentially? But what happened was the next day, there were a group of American pastors who were visiting, and they were so touched by this woman's gift that they bid against each other to buy the rice bowl. First bid was $5,000, and then it just started going up from there, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and that little rice bowl sold for tens of thousands of dollars. Because a woman was willing to say, God, I'm going to give you what I have. I can't give you more than that. But I'm going to give you what I have, as small as it might be, and believe that you're going to do something amazing through it. That's how God works. He loves it. Hearts that are full of compassion and worship, sacrifice, and faith. Jesus, I thank you for the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of others. Not because of our talent or our education or our religious background or our financial wealth, but because of our hearts that are surrendered to you, that are open before you. God, I pray that you would find in our church hearts that are full of faith, full of compassion, hearts that you can use. Amen.